So, what does Paul's audience have anything to do with the homosexuality debate in the Bible? Hi, my name is Dr. Jordan Koss, and this is the Millennial Harbinger channel.
And here we go.
I've been meaning to get this video out this summer, and tomorrow actually is my first day back at work as a teacher. So today is my last day of summer. So here we go. I am finally getting this video wrapped up and completed today on what we're going to talk about, which is Psalm 106. There's this book that has this one particular article in it. The book is The Beginning of Paul's Gospel, Theological Explorations Within Romans 1 through 4. And it was edited by Nijay Gupta and John K. Goodrich. Goodrich is the author of this particular chapter and article. In chapter 5, he wrote, Exchanging God and Surrendering Humanity, the Historical Plausibility of Paul's allusion to Psalm 106 in Romans 1:18 through 32. And that fancy title basically says what he's insinuating in this title, what he's basically trying to communicate is Paul uses Psalm 106 as kind of like his main Old Testament reference text to make his argument in Romans 1:18 to 32. That's basically what he's saying with that fancy title.
That's fancy. That's fancy.
Okay. All right. So here's what I want to talk about based upon this, what this article argues. Okay. So Goodrich argues that Paul is influenced in Romans 1:18 through 32 principally by a single or primary scriptural verse. That is Psalm 106, verses 20 and 41. And more specifically, the Septuagint text of Psalm 106, which happens to be in the Septuagint in Psalm 105. All right? So basically what he means by this is Paul is talking to Jews. All right? That's what he's trying to argue in this article.
What are we talking about?
Next, here's what he's trying to kind of counteract, or what he says or calls problematize. All right? He wants to problematize the Gentile-only reading of 1:18 to 32, and thus the following reading of the Gentile interlocutor reading of chapter 2, verses 1 through 5. And we'll talk about what the interlocutor term is referring to in a little bit. But basically, this view says that instead of talking to Jews, Paul is talking to Gentiles in Romans 1:18 to 32. Okay?
The Jews?
Yes, and even the Gentiles.
Okay, so basically, we have these two main readings of the text. These are these are the two primary ways, or two primary readings in terms of who Paul's audience is in Romans 1:18 and following. We got the Gentile-only, and we got the Jews/all of humanity view. So the Gentile-only reading, and here's something that I've noticed as I've done a good bit of reading in terms of this whole same-sex sexual identity, behavior, argument, and hot topic in the church today and in the broader culture. I've seen, at least, this is my take, or just my opinion on what I've read, and that is the Gentile-only reading seems to be the reading that affirming authors take for Romans 1 and 2. And when you take the Gentile-only audience reading in Romans 1 and 2, oftentimes what you see the affirming author do is not highlight an Old Testament text as Paul's like main text that he's using to make his argument in these two chapters. Rather, what you use is, or what you argue is, that the wisdom of Solomon passages and chapters in that intertestamental work, you're saying, hey, Paul is using the wisdom of Solomon as his primary text to make his argument here, and not any other text. Okay? That's what I've seen, at least. All right? The Jews/all humanity reading, it, to me, in my opinion, based upon what I've read, it seems to be the position that non-affirming authors take. And if you know of affirming author that takes this other view, or vice versa, like, let me know. I'd love it if you shared that insight with me. But when you have a non-affirming reading, these non-affirming takes using the Jews all humanity reading audience argument in Romans 1 and 2, what you see them emphasizing or saying that, hey, this is Paul's primary text he's referencing and using to make his argument here, isn't Wisdom of Solomon. It's rather Psalm 106. I don't know if that's your experience based upon what you've read, but for the good number of books, articles, etc., commentaries that I've read, this seems to be the case to me. I'm welcoming you to prove me wrong. Okay? All right.
Well, Hiroko, in my experience.
But what Goodrich does in this article to try to make his point that Paul is actually using Psalm 106 as his primary text to make the argument in Romans 1 and 2, what he does is he calls on Richard Hayes's work, The Echoes of Scripture and the Letters of Paul. Hayes came out with that book 20 plus years ago. I know I used it when I wrote my master's thesis on a passage Paul wrote in 2 Corinthians 4 and 5. I wrote a whole chapter on intertextuality. I didn't even know what intertextuality was in 2006, but I figured out what it was having to write that chapter 20 years ago. But Goodrich does this very same thing. He tries to find, he takes Hayes's arguments for finding echo detection from that book 20 or so years ago, The Echoes of Scripture and the Letters of Paul. And he's like, I'm going to take 3 of Hayes's criteria, and I'm going to show you that Paul is using Psalm 106 as his main text of reference here in Romans 1 and 2 by using, again, these 3 criteria: volume, thematic coherence, and historical plausibility.
The only criteria is money.
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through each of these criteria one at a time. Time doesn't permit for us to kind of highlight every single piece of evidence that Goodrich puts forward for each of these criteria. I'm just going to kind of give this summary argument for volume, thematic coherence, and historical plausibility, and to kind of give my quick take. Okay, so in terms of volume, Goodrich defines volume as a degree of explicit repetition of words or syntactical patterns between a source text and a receptor text. So the source text would be obviously Psalm 106, and Paul is using that source text in his receptor text, or the text that he is writing, Romans 1 and 2. Okay, so Goodrich at the end of this section says, thus, taken together, Paul's repetition of key terms and syntactical patterns from Septuagint Psalm 106 verses 20 and 41, as many as 3 times each, he says, suggest he is alluding to the song throughout Romans 1, 23 through 28. And remember, the whole exchanged terminology and the whole handed over terminology, each of those terms used 3 times each in Romans 1, 23 through 28, just overwhelmingly hints at Paul actually, yes, he's intentionally using Psalm 106 as his source text to make his argument. All right.
Something simple and repetitive.
All right, number 2, thematic coherence. Thematic coherence considers how well the proposed source text fits conceptually and rhetorically with the receptor text, right? Sounding very fancy here. But basically, this is what Goodrich kind of concludes. He sees both Psalm 106 and Romans 1 and 2 doing the same things. And so as a result of seeing them do the same things, he's saying that there is thematic coherence between the two. And thus we can see as a result that Psalm 106 is his source text. All right, so here's some of the things he sees both passages doing. I think I have 5 things here. He sees both Psalm 106 and Romans 1 and 2 oscillate between catalogs of sinful past behaviors and divine retributive activity. Okay? Psalm 106 regales Israel's failures and how God responded to them in terms of judgment. So does Romans 1 and 2. All right? He sees both texts, number 2, highlight or imply the same types of sinful behaviors. He says both Psalm 106 and Romans 1 and 2 highlight particular sins such as idolatry and sexual immorality. And that's so interesting because I even wrote this in my paper that I read in the first couple videos of this channel, that there's this weird connection throughout Scripture from very beginning on of idolatry and sexual immorality. All right, and I always wanted to. I want to continue to try to like dig at that to kind of see what else is there. But he said he sees Psalm 106 and Romans 1 and 2 emphasizing both idolatry and sexual immorality flowing from that idolatry. Okay, number 3, he sees another theme in terms of cohering between the two of both employ an abundance of cognitive terms suggesting willful neglect of God's revelatory work. Okay, there's a lot of terms, he says, showing these cognitive terms suggesting and showing how both the people of Israel and whoever Paul is referencing in Romans 1 and 2 are willfully neglecting God's revelatory work, showing that he is God. And so they're just denying that and rebelling against God despite that fact. Okay, I'm getting wordy here. I'm going to stop trying to be so wordy. Number 4, he sees both including a shared corporate dimension to sin. Just as Psalm 106 talks about how Israel sinned in the past, and the current readers of that psalm of Israel's history are themselves kind of corporately included in that guilt, in that sin. So Romans 1 and 2 also kind of carries with it that same corporate dimension to sin and responsibility to that sin, whether they themselves committed it or not. That's a big deal. That's a big thing in like the Old Testament, this corporate dimension to sin and guilt that we've lost in our culture because we're so individualistic. But that's one of the things we need to kind of regain. I think that we've lost. All right. And the fifth thing, he's like, both have like this exilic context, the idea of being exchanged and handed over, leading to exile. And plus the readers of this text are kind of like also in some sense, either literally or metaphorically in exile in Psalm 106. But also you see that at play as well in Romans 1 and 2, where he's insinuating this metaphorical exile. We're separated from God as a result of humanity's exchanging Yahweh for the other gods and therefore being handed over. We're separated from God as a result of being handed over to the gods. And we'll get more into that historical schema in a minute. But those are some of the similarities between these two texts. The source, Psalm 106, and the receptor text of Romans 1 and 2, he says, hey, there's thematic coherence here between the two. Okay.
Anyway, now that you seem to be coherent and better.
All right. So the third criteria that Goodrich uses to make his argument is historical plausibility. And historical plausibility means seeking to show that Paul could have intended the proposed allusion to Psalm 106 based on its degree of intelligibility to the apostles' contemporaries. So Paul could have used Psalm 106, but would that have been something his readers, his audience would have been able to see? Would that have been something that they were expecting, have seen before multiple times? And thus, when Paul is using it here, they would have been like, oh yeah, we know what he's doing. We know what he's referencing. Historical plausibility, I guess. That's one way of putting it. All right. And so he basically says this. He after examining two other post-exilic texts, this is what he says. Having established two post-exilic works, Nehemiah 9 and 4Q Pseudo-Daniel, drawing upon Psalm 106:20 and Psalm 106:41, we conclude that it is indeed historically plausible that Paul redeployed the same verses in comparable ways in Romans 1:18-32. So he says, Goodrich argues, all right, so Psalm 106 does its thing. But Jews before Paul, but after Psalm 106 was written and compiled and put into the Hebrew Bible, in between Psalm 106 and Romans 1, other Jews did the same thing that Paul was doing in Romans 1 and 2 with Psalm 106. And we could see that both in Nehemiah 9, a post-exilic text, and we can see that in Pseudo-Daniel, another post-exilic text. So Paul's not doing anything new. He's doing what many Jews have done before and have seen before, and perhaps might even be expecting it. So he's like, okay, based upon that examination, it's definitely historically plausible, he argues. All right.
Sounds plausible.
All right, so now I'm going to share with you a couple quotes from Goodrich in the closing kind of pages and paragraphs of his article. Here's one of the things he contends. He contends that the historical survey in Psalm 106 was not only repeatedly evoked in early Jewish historical summaries, like he just argued what we just mentioned in Nehemiah 9 and Pseudo-Daniel, but that Psalm 106, 20 and 41, separated as they are by some 21 verses, became conflated in the Jewish historiographical mind, thereby forming a basic narrative schema consisting of Israel exchanging God, one, through idolatrous practices. Exchanging insinuates and assumes idolatry, all right? And in turn, God surrendering or handing over Israel into the hands of hostile forces, i.e., the gods. Even when Israel is handed over to their rival nations, that the synonymous understanding and thought there is that they're also handed over to the gods. So exchange/idolatry plus handed over to the gods equals exile, separation from God. All right? So we see in Psalm 106 and Nehemiah 9, Pseudo-Daniel, Romans 1 and 2, this Jewish narrative schema being used here of exchange, handed over equals exile. Okay.
Hey, your algorithm is solid. It's a really good schema.
What's interesting is that we see this narrative schema, this referencing of Psalm 106, not just in Paul, but also in what Luke wrote, particularly in Acts chapter 7 in Stephen's speech, which itself is a kind of historical survey of Israel's past and this corporate understanding of their sin. We still do the same things that they did, right? We're no better than them. So here's what Goodrich says. In his historical review before the Sanhedrin, Stephen fuses Psalm 106, 19 through 20 together with Psalm 106, 41 to draw a comparison between his ancestors and contemporaries. The fact that this schema was deployed in numerous post-exilic texts suggests that it became a usable form of commemoration in Israelite historiography, one that eventually became available and serviceable to the Apostle Paul, which he used in, as he's arguing, in Romans 1 and 2.
Maybe we can use it.
So here we go. I'm going to show you 3 verses from Stephen's speech, Acts 7, 41 through 43, where he references and uses Psalm 106 within the speech, just like Paul. Stephen says, "That was the time they made an idol in the form of a calf. They brought sacrifices to it and reveled in what their own hands had made." So just like Psalm 106 does, Stephen references the sin at Sinai of the golden calf. All right. "But God turned away from them and gave them over, handed them over to the worship of the sun, moon, and stars." And isn't that interesting that what Stephen does with this is that he kind of pulls together the idolatry, the exchanging, and the handing over, but he adds in this concept, this image of the sun, moon, and stars, which is a common image within the Hebrew Bible and even the New Testament, to use the sun, moon, and stars as an image for supernatural beings, heavenly beings, whether good or evil, right? But especially Deuteronomy 4, one of the main passages in the Deuteronomy 32 worldview, where God through Moses says, "Hey, don't worship the sun, moon, and stars. I'm the Most High, worship me." And Israel doesn't do that. And Stephen's about to tell him, "Hey, they didn't do it. You're still not doing it, right? You're worshiping the sun, moon, and stars." So this agrees with, Stephen goes on, this agrees with what is written in the book of the prophets. "Did you bring me sacrifices and offerings 40 years in the wilderness, people of Israel? You have taken up the tabernacle of Molech and the star of your god, Rephan, the idols you made to worship. Therefore, I will send you into exile beyond Babylon." So there we have a specific reference of like how exchanging plus handing over to the gods equals exile, separation from God. but really cool. Like Stephen within this speech does exactly what Psalm 106 does, as well as that corporate identity and guilt of sin. What Israel did then, we're still guilty of today, and oftentimes worse, right? Hey, they were bad, but man, you guys, man, you take the cake, right? All right. So here's one thing about the Jewish interlocutor in Romans 2, 1 through 5 that Goodrich says. So he says, it is most plausible that in Romans 2, 1 through 5, this big shift in the tone and everything, like what's going on here between 1, 18 to 32 and 2, 1 through 5? Who's being spoken to and who's the one doing the speaking, right? It is most plausible, Goodrich argues, that Paul is speaking to a presumptuous Jew, not a Gentile, but rather a presumptuous Jew who's like, hey, I didn't do that. So, why am I being lumped into their sins? Something like that. Like, I'm not as bad as, the Gentiles or the Jews of the past, right? He goes on, he says, quite a strong case can be, and actually has been made by Limbaugh. Limbaugh wrote, I believe, his dissertation, and it was later published as a book on kind of looking at how the wisdom of Solomon was used by Paul in Romans 1 and 2. And that's a really important text to look at that I've mentioned before, that when I do make a video about how Paul uses wisdom of Solomon, that will also kind of counteract and problematize those authors, mainly affirming authors, who want to say, hey, Paul is using this first and foremost to make their affirming argument. Haven't made that video yet. It's coming sometime. Can't say when, but it's coming. But quite a strong case can be made, Goodrich argues. And then he says, and it already has been by Limbaugh, right? That Paul's interlocutor is a Jew in the tradition of wisdom of Solomon. And if such a reading can be supported, then the interlocutor's participation in the sins enumerated in 118 to 32 probably works on the basis of his corporate identification with the sins of historic Israel. All right, so pretty cool. Just wanted to add that little note in there. Again, a little taste before the actual video on responding to Wisdom of Solomon comes out sometime in the future. Don't know when.
Don't know.
Okay, a few more thoughts before we finish up here. One of the things that Goodrich says is there is no other way for Romans 1:18 through 2:5 to work other than by a corporate, even multi-generational approach to sin. I thought that was something significant to highlight in his article. Another thing he said, in sum, we must resist the impulse to force Paul's indictment to apply only to wicked Gentiles, when he says the schema, the epistemology, the history of Israelite infidelity create ample room for him to have included his Jewish kinsmen. So you could say not only does Paul have Jews as his target audience in Romans 1, but you could also say that he has all of humanity in view in Romans 1:18 through 32 instead of just Gentiles only. I really think that that is the better reading of the text. And this article is one source, at least, that helps us see that brings that to the surface.
Take them up to the surface.
Okay. Here's some final thoughts from me to kind of conclude this whole video. All right. So number one, here's the narrative schema on the screen. The narrative schema, again, is when you exchange God, the Most High, for the worship of those things, those gods that are not the Most High, right? Because idolatry is literally worshiping another created being, that is, as opposed to the uncreated, true Most High God, Yahweh. When you exchange and commit idolatry, God's response is to then hand you over. And the assumption and the implication is you are being handed over to the gods, or to what Paul later in the letter again calls angels and rulers. The NIV translates that hendiadys as angels and demons. They assume that Paul is referencing supernatural evil there, but the literal translation is angels and rulers. So the angels and rulers in Romans 8:38 refer back to the Old Testament gods of the nations, which I talk about in a previous video on Romans 1 and all that, and in the video where I kind of talk about Ron Johnson's dissertation. I think it's the last video I made. Could be wrong. Okay, number 2, affirming scholars. We got to just note this again. Affirming scholars like Beverly Gaventa, who came out with a great Romans commentary recently, what she does is basically ignore Psalm 106. She's probably the best scholar to even have a discussion about handing over. I haven't found another biblical scholar to have a better discussion on the term paradidomi and handing over within Paul's writings and outside of Paul's writings. But for whatever reason, she ignores Psalm 106. But for whatever reason, affirming scholars do not highlight that Paul is actually using Psalm 106 in Romans 1 and 2. And I don't know why. For the life of me, I just don't know why. Are they intentionally ignoring it? Are they just not seeing it? I don't know. But one of the results of them not seeing and not highlighting and ignoring Psalm 106 is that it kind of disenchants their reading of the passage. All right. Last thought. Interestingly enough, both Luke and Paul used this narrative schema found in Psalm 106 in their writings. So Luke and Paul together have written over 50% of the New Testament in their writings alone. So if it's in Luke and Paul, you can probably bet it's found in the rest of the Gospels and the rest of the letters and documents of the New Testament as well. But Luke in Acts 7, Paul in Romans 1 are 2 places that this narrative schema can be found. And their writings and their worldview as a result of their writings comprise over half of the New Testament. All right, this was a fun video to make. Took me a while to get it out, but hopefully you learned something from it. Thanks for watching all the way to the end. We will see you next time. Goodbye.
And I stand by my performance.
He shall.